Welcome to Wars and Dusk. Tonight, we journey to the dark hours before June 6, 1944, when paratroopers fell blind into Normandy and a single chain of decisions nearly unraveled the largest invasion in history before a single boot touched the beach. If history's greatest conflicts are your kind of bedtime story, subscribe before you drift off. Now get comfortable. Close your eyes, and let the past carry you to sleep. Opening meditation. There is a particular quality to the darkness just before dawn. It is not the darkness of midnight, which carries its own settled stillness. The darkness before dawn is different. It is the darkness of held breath, of waiting, of something immense gathering itself just beyond the edge of sight. More than 5,000 ships, 11,000 aircraft, nearly 160,000 men. All of them committed to a single day, a single plan, a single narrow coast of sand and grass and fortified concrete. Tonight, we will settle into that darkness together. We will move slowly through the hours before dawn on the 6th of June, 1944. We will follow the men who made the decisions, the generals and the planners, the paratroopers falling through the dark, the sailors watching the waves, the soldiers waiting in the bellies of landing craft, unable to see what lay ahead. This is not a story of triumph announced in advance. This is a story of near failure. Of calculations made under impossible pressure. Of weather, and wind, and chance, and the terrifying fragility of even the most carefully constructed plan when it meets reality. Let your breath slow. Let your body become heavy and still. The history we carry tonight is enormous, but it can be carried gently, respectfully, one quiet moment at a time. We begin in the place where all great operations begin. Not on the battlefield. In a room, with a map, and a decision that cannot be unmade. Part 1, The Weight of the Plan. And the plan was extraordinarily, almost impossibly, complex. Operation Overlord, as the Normandy invasion was formally named, had been in development since the spring of 1943. It had consumed more planning hours, more intelligence resources, more logistical calculation than any single military operation in the history of warfare to that point. And at its center, at the intersection of all those calculations, was a question that no amount of planning could fully answer. Would it actually work? To understand why D-Day almost failed before dawn, we have to understand what the planners were attempting. They were not simply moving men across water. They were attempting to land an army, a force large enough to crack open the Atlantic Wall, Germany's fortified coastal defense system stretching from Norway to the Spanish border, on a defended shore, in a narrow tidal window, dependent on specific weather conditions, coordinated with airborne drops that had never been attempted on this scale, supported by naval bombardment that needed to begin before first light. Every element of the plan was connected to every other element. Pull out one thread, and the entire fabric could unravel. The man most responsible for holding those threads together was General Dwight David Eisenhower. He had been appointed Supreme Commander of the Allied Expeditionary Force in December of 1943, and from the moment he took command, the weight of what was being asked of him was clear to anyone who looked closely at his face. Eisenhower was not a battlefield commander in the traditional sense. He had never led troops in combat. What he possessed, in extraordinary measure, was something rarer and in some ways more valuable, the ability to hold together a coalition of proud, difficult, often competing military personalities and national interests, and to direct that coalition toward a single objective. He was, at his core, a manager of human complexity under pressure. In early June of 1944, those dates fell on the 5th, the 6th, and the 7th. After those 3 days, the next acceptable window would not come for 2 weeks. And 2 weeks was too long. The operation could not stay hidden, could not stay assembled and ready, for 2 additional weeks without something going wrong. On June the 4th, Eisenhower's chief meteorologist, Group Captain James Stagg, delivered a forecast that changed everything. A massive storm system was moving across the Atlantic. The weather on June the 5th would be unacceptable for the invasion: high winds, heavy cloud cover, rough seas. Eisenhower postponed for 24 hours. 160,000 men, already briefed and loaded, had to wait one more day in their ships and their barracks, carrying the knowledge of what the next day might bring. Then, on the evening of the 4th, Stagg returned with a narrow, uncertain promise. There would be a brief break in the weather. Not ideal conditions. Not the calm sea and clear sky the planners had envisioned. But a window, perhaps 36 hours long, in which the operation could proceed. Eisenhower sat with his commanders. They gave their opinions. Some favored waiting. Some favored going. And then the room fell quiet, and the decision rested with one man. He sat in silence for what some who were present described as a very long time. And then he spoke. He said, "Okay. Let's go." Those 3 words set in motion the largest amphibious invasion in human history. They also set in motion everything that was about to go wrong. Because the plan, as beautifully constructed as it was, depended on many things happening in precise sequence. And the weather that Stagg had promised, that narrow, uncertain window, was already testing the edges of what the men and machines could endure. And that was just the crossing. The other component of the plan, the one that was already in motion before most of the beach assault forces had even left the English ports, was the airborne operation. And the airborne operation was already in serious trouble. But the sky over Normandy was not cooperating. The cloud cover that the forecasters had predicted might be manageable was, in places, far worse than anticipated. Formation flying became nearly impossible. Pilots, trying to avoid both the clouds and each other, scattered. Navigation grew uncertain. And below them, waiting in the dark, the German anti-aircraft batteries were already alert. The men in the transports felt the flak before they could see it. The aircraft shook and lurched. Some burst into flame. Pilots, desperate to get their men out and away from the fire, gave the green light for the jump at the wrong moment, at the wrong altitude, in the wrong place. The great airborne drop, so carefully rehearsed, so precisely planned, was already unraveling over the dark fields of Normandy. To understand what was at stake in the early hours of June the 6th, it helps to step back, not by days, but by years, and understand how the world had arrived at this particular shore on this particular night. The Second World War in Europe had been grinding for nearly 5 years by the summer of 1944. Germany had conquered France in a matter of weeks in the spring and summer of 1940. The speed of that conquest had stunned the world. The French army, one of the largest and most respected in Europe, had collapsed in less than 7 weeks. The British Expeditionary Force had been driven to the sea at Dunkirk and evacuated only through a combination of desperate improvisation and extraordinary luck. After Dunkirk, Britain stood alone on the western edge of the continent. The United States was still officially neutral. The Soviet Union had a non-aggression pact with Germany. The Atlantic Ocean was the only thing standing between the Third Reich and total domination of Western Europe. That situation began to change in the summer of 1941, when Germany invaded the Soviet Union in Operation Barbarossa. The invasion was a strategic gamble of enormous proportions, and while it succeeded spectacularly in its early months, it also opened an eastern front that would eventually consume the German army in ways its planners had never anticipated. Then, in December of 1941, Japan attacked the American naval base at Pearl Harbor. The United States entered the war. And the strategic balance, which had already been shifting, began to move with accelerating force against Germany. But the question of how to strike directly at Germany, how to bring the war to the European mainland in force, was one that the Allied leaders debated intensely and often bitterly for years. The Soviet Union, bearing the overwhelming weight of the land war in the East, pressed constantly for what Stalin called a second front, a major Allied landing in Western Europe that would force Germany to divide its forces and relieve the pressure on the Red Army. The British were cautious. Churchill, who had lived through the catastrophic losses of the First World War, was deeply wary of a direct assault on fortified German positions. He preferred a peripheral strategy, striking at the edges of the Axis Empire, in North Africa, in Sicily, in Italy, wearing Germany down before attempting the great decisive blow. That decision set the clock running on the most elaborate military deception in history. Because the Germans were not waiting passively for an invasion. They knew it was coming. The question that Field Marshal Erwin Rommel and the German High Command spent months agonizing over, was where. The French coastline offered hundreds of possible landing sites. The Pas-de-Calais, the narrow stretch of water where England and France are only 21 miles apart, was the most obvious. It offered the shortest crossing, the fastest route toward Germany's industrial heartland, and the most direct strategic objective. The Germans expected it there above all. This expectation was something the Allies worked very hard to cultivate. Operation Bodyguard, the overarching Allied deception program, was a masterpiece of strategic misdirection. It involved phantom armies commanded by real generals, false radio traffic, elaborate double agents feeding fabricated intelligence to German handlers, and a sustained campaign to make the Germans believe that any landing in Normandy was merely a feint, and that the real blow would fall at the Pas-de-Calais. The centerpiece of this deception was a notional formation called the 1st United States Army Group, or FUSAG, which was stationed in southeast England, directly opposite the Pas-de-Calais. And at its head, in name only, since his public humiliation over the slapping incident in Sicily had temporarily removed him from active command, was General George Patton. The Germans considered Patton the most dangerous American commander. His presence in southeast England was, to their intelligence services, convincing evidence that the real invasion would come there. But while the deception planners were weaving their elaborate web, the actual invasion planners were working on a different coast entirely. Normandy. A roughly 50-mile stretch of beach and cliff on the southwestern curve of the Normandy coast, divided by the Allies into 5 landing zones: Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juneau, and Sword. The choice of Normandy was driven by several factors. Its beaches, while not perfect, were more suitable for mass landings than the rocky cliffs of the Pas-de-Calais. The local German defenses, while formidable, were not as densely concentrated as those further north. And crucially, the French port of Cherbourg lay at the base of the Cotentin Peninsula, just northwest of the landing zone, a port that, once captured, could supply the immense logistical needs of the invading army. Planning for the Normandy landings had begun in earnest under the British General Frederick Morgan in the spring of 1943. When Eisenhower took command at the end of that year, one of his first acts was to expand the operation. Morgan's original plan called for 3 divisions in the assault wave. Eisenhower, supported by his ground forces commander General Bernard Montgomery, expanded this to 5 divisions, adding 2 more beaches to the plan and increasing the size of the airborne operation from 2 to 3 divisions. This expansion required more landing craft, which delayed the invasion but also made it more powerful. And more powerful was exactly what it needed to be, because of what Erwin Rommel had been doing to the beaches of Normandy since the previous autumn. Rommel had been appointed to command Army Group B, which was responsible for the coastal defenses in France, in late 1943. He arrived, looked at the defenses, and was appalled. They were, in his assessment, nowhere near adequate to stop a determined Allied landing. And if the Allies got ashore in force, Rommel believed, the battle would be lost. Germany could not afford a prolonged campaign in the west while the Red Army was pressing from the east. His solution was characteristically aggressive. He ordered the construction of millions of additional beach obstacles, steel crosses, wooden stakes tipped with mines, concrete barriers, positioned to tear open the bottoms of landing craft at high tide. He ordered the laying of minefields on the beaches and in the tidal flats. He ordered the construction of reinforced gun positions, mortar pits, and bunkers. He ordered the flooding of inland areas behind the beaches to drown paratroopers before they could organize. By the spring of 1944, the beaches of Normandy had been transformed into a killing ground of extraordinary lethality. The men who would have to cross those beaches knew, in general terms, what awaited them. The briefings had been thorough. The aerial photographs, the intelligence reports, the scale models of the landing zones, all of it pointed to the same conclusion. This was going to be enormously costly. The casualties in the first assault wave were expected to be devastating. And so they waited, and they prepared, and they wrote letters home that they were not sure they would survive to see delivered. Part 3. Fortress Europe and its defenders. Standing against the invasion was an army spread across 1,500 miles of occupied European coastline. But to understand the German position in Normandy in June of 1944, we need to understand that the men defending those beaches were not all the same. They were not a uniform force. They were a patchwork of experience, quality, exhaustion, and conviction, bound together by a chain of command that, at its highest levels, was in profound disagreement about how to fight the battle that was coming. The German 7th Army, commanded by Colonel General Friedrich Dahlmann, was responsible for the Normandy coast. Underneath him, Rommel's Army Group B exercised operational oversight. And above both of them, the Commander-in-Chief West, Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, held overall command. The disagreement between Rommel and von Rundstedt was not a minor one. It was fundamental. And it would shape the entire course of the battle. Rommel believed the battle had to be won on the beaches, or not at all. His experience in North Africa, where Allied air power had made movement of reserves nearly impossible in daylight, had convinced him that German armored formations could not be moved to the battle in time to influence it if they were held back. The Allies would have air superiority. Any large movement of tanks and trucks on French roads in daylight would be devastated from the air. Therefore, he argued, the panzer divisions, the armored units that were the only force capable of driving an Allied landing back into the sea, had to be positioned close to the beaches, ready to counterattack within hours of the first landings. Von Rundstedt disagreed. He favored a more classical defensive approach: hold the panzer divisions in reserve, let the invasion develop, identify the main Allied effort, and then strike with concentrated armored force at the critical moment. He believed that the beach defenses alone could not stop a determined Allied assault, and that the decisive battle would be fought inland. The argument went all the way to Hitler. And Hitler's solution was, in its way, characteristic: he split the difference. Some panzer divisions were placed under Rommel's control, close to the coast. Others were held in a central reserve. And crucially, several of the most powerful armored formations, including the 1st SS Panzer Corps, were designated as OKW Reserve, meaning they could only be committed with Hitler's personal authorization. This division of authority would prove catastrophic on June 6. But on the beaches themselves, the men doing the waiting were not generals arguing over strategy. They were soldiers. Many of them young. Many of them far from home. And many of them, by the summer of 1944, exhausted in ways that went deeper than sleep. The German army that had swept across Europe in 1939 and 1940 was not the army that held the beaches of Normandy in 1944. The elite formations, the highly trained and experienced infantry and panzer divisions, had been fed into the furnace of the Eastern Front in enormous numbers. The men in many of the Normandy coastal divisions were often older soldiers, men recovering from wounds, men transferred from other theaters with diminished strength, or, in the case of several divisions, men who were not German at all. Among the defenders in Normandy were soldiers from the Soviet Union, from Eastern Europe, from Central Asia, men who had been captured by the Germans on the Eastern Front and given a brutal choice: the prisoner of war camp, where death by starvation and exposure was a near certainty, or service in German uniform. Many had chosen to live. Their willingness to fight and die for their captors when the moment of testing came was, unsurprisingly, uncertain. And yet some of the German formations in Normandy were formidable by any standard. The 352nd Infantry Division, which had been moved to the coast in March of 1944 to reinforce the beach defenses, was a battle-hardened formation with recent experience on the Eastern Front. It occupied the bluffs and beaches that the Americans called Omaha, and its presence there, which Allied intelligence had not detected in time to significantly alter the plan, would contribute to the most terrible fighting of the entire day. The 716th Infantry Division held a wider section of the coast to the east, including sections of what would become Gold, Juno, and Sword beaches. It was a static division, meaning it lacked the motor transport to move quickly, filled with older soldiers and a high proportion of non-German conscripts. Its fighting value was lower, but its positions were prepared, its weapons were sighted, and its concrete bunkers were solid. And then there was the 21st Panzer Division, positioned south of Cannes, the largest city in the Normandy region and a key objective for the British landings. The 21st Panzer was one of the formations that had been placed under Rommel's authority, and on the night of June the 5th, it sat in its assembly areas, its tanks fueled and ready, waiting for orders that would be a very long time coming. The German intelligence services had been trying to determine when and where the invasion would come for months. They had information, some of it good, much of it carefully shaped by the Allied deception operation. They knew the invasion was imminent. Agent reports, prisoner interrogations, aerial reconnaissance of the English ports, all of it pointed to a landing somewhere in France, and soon. What they did not know, what the elaborate deception of Operation Bodyguard had succeeded in concealing, was the specific time and place. It was an entirely rational assessment. It was also completely wrong. Part 4. The paratroopers fall into darkness. Just past midnight on the morning of June the 6th, the sky over Normandy began to fill with the sound of aircraft engines. It was a sound unlike anything the sleeping Norman countryside had heard before, a deep, sustained roar that built from distant whisper to overwhelming presence as hundreds of C-47 transport aircraft crossed the coast in massive formations. 13,000 American paratroopers of the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions were about to step into the darkness over occupied France. The 101st Airborne Division, the Screaming Eagles, was commanded by General Maxwell Taylor. Its mission was to drop into the area just behind Utah Beach, the westernmost of the 5 landing zones, and seize the causeways that crossed the flooded fields behind the beach. Without those causeways, the men landing at Utah could not move inland. They would be trapped on the beach while the tide came in behind them. The 82nd Airborne, the All-American Division, commanded by General Matthew Ridgway, had 2 main objectives. One regiment was to drop and seize the town of Saint-Mère-Église, the first town in France that the Allies planned to liberate, which sat astride a critical road junction. 2 other regiments were to drop west of the Murderette River and secure the flanks against German armored counterattack. The British 6th Airborne Division, on the eastern flank, had equally critical objectives, including the capture of the bridges over the Orne River and the Caen Canal, and the destruction of a formidable German battery at Merville that threatened the landing fleet. All of these operations depended on the paratroopers landing close enough to their objectives to organize and fight effectively. And all of them began to go wrong in the first moments of the drop. The problem was cloud and flak, in roughly equal measure. The cloud cover over Normandy was uneven, clear in some places, thick in others. As the transport formations crossed the coast, the pilots encountered clouds that made formation flying dangerous. Aircraft that had been flying in tight, disciplined formation began to scatter as pilots broke away from banks of cloud to avoid collision. At the same time, German anti-aircraft batteries had been alerted by the sound of the approaching aircraft. The flak that rose from below was inaccurate in the darkness. The German gunners were firing largely blind, but it was terrifying and it was effective in its own way. Pilots who had held their altitude and course through the cloud began to take violent evasive action when the first bursts of flak appeared around them. The combination of scattered cloud and flak-induced evasion destroyed the integrity of the formations. Aircraft that had been flying 60 seconds apart began to arrive over the drop zones with intervals of 30 seconds, or 2 minutes, or 5 minutes. Some aircraft overshot the drop zones entirely. Some were so far off course that they dropped their paratroopers miles from where they were supposed to land. And then came the green light. The pilots, in many cases uncertain of their exact position, gave the jump signal and the sticks of paratroopers went out the door, into darkness, into wind, into the unknown. The experience of a night parachute jump into combat is one of the most disorienting things a human being can undergo. There is a moment of controlled violence as the parachute opens, a brief silence as the descent begins, and then the ground comes up faster than expected and the landing is almost always hard. In training, you know roughly where you are. In combat, at night, in a scattered drop, you may have no idea at all. Many of the paratroopers of the 101st and 82nd Divisions found themselves alone in dark Norman fields, unable to see more than a few yards in any direction, listening for the distinctive sound of the metal cricket, the small spring-loaded clicker that was their recognition signal, and hearing, in the distance, the rattle of small arms fire and the thump of flak guns. They had been told to use the cricket, one click would be answered with two. They moved through the darkness, clicking and listening, slowly gathering into small groups of men who were often from different units, who might not know each other, but who were alive and armed and ready to fight. In St. Miraglise, something happened that the town has never forgotten. The town was already awake that night, a house had caught fire, and the townspeople, including a work party of French civilians forced out under German guard to fight the fire, were in the town square. The sound of aircraft brought German soldiers out of their billets. And then the paratroopers began to fall. Men of the 82nd Airborne's 505th Parachute Infantry Regiment came down directly over the lit town square, in plain view of the German garrison. Several were shot before they reached the ground. One man, Private John Steele, had his parachute catch on the church spire and hung there, swinging in the firelight, playing dead while the battle raged below him. He would survive, and his story would become one of the most vivid images of the entire night's chaos. Despite the horror of the drop, and it was, by any measure, far worse than anyone had hoped, something remarkable happened. The paratroopers adapted. They improvised. Small groups of men, often mixed from different units, often led by sergeants and junior officers because the senior commanders had scattered even further, began to coalesce around whatever objective was nearby and attack it. The town of St. Miraglise was taken by the 82nd Airborne before dawn. It was the first town liberated from German occupation in Western Europe. But the causeways behind Utah Beach, which the 101st needed to secure, were only partly in American hands when the first landing craft touched the beach. The 82nd's planned seizure of the Murderette bridges was a partial success at best. The wide scatter of the drop meant that many men were fighting hours away from where they were supposed to be. And on the British left flank, things had gone somewhat better, for reasons that would take days to fully understand. The 6th Airborne Division's glider operation, men carried in large engineless aircraft rather than dropped by parachute, had achieved something extraordinary in the very first minutes of June the 6th. A small force of men from D Company of the Oxfordshire and Buckinghamshire Light Infantry had landed in 3 Horsa gliders in a field just feet from the bridge over the Caen Canal at a place called Benouville, rushed the bridge before the German garrison could demolish it, and captured it intact within 10 minutes of landing. That bridge, which would later be renamed Pegasus Bridge, for the winged horse badge of the British Airborne, was one of the most perfectly executed tactical operations of the entire Normandy campaign. And it had been accomplished in total darkness, by a handful of men who had no way of knowing, as their gliders crunched to a halt in the darkness, that they had just landed in exactly the right place. Part 5: The Commanders and Their Calculations. While the paratroopers fell through the darkness over Normandy, the men who were responsible for the overall shape of the battle were themselves facing a kind of darkness, a darkness of information, of uncertainty, of decisions that had to be made without knowing what the outcome would be. Eisenhower had given his order. The machinery was in motion. But the Supreme Commander, sitting in his headquarters in England, could do very little but wait. In the hours between giving the order to go and the first reports arriving from Normandy, he occupied himself the way that leaders sometimes do when the outcome is beyond their immediate influence. He wrote a message. It was not a message of triumph. It was a message of failure, prepared in advance, to be released if the invasion was driven back into the sea. He wrote, "Our landings in the Cherbourg-Havre area have failed to gain a satisfactory foothold and I have withdrawn the troops. My decision to attack at this time and place was based upon the best information available. The troops, the air, and the Navy did all that bravery and devotion to duty could do. If any blame or fault attaches to the attempt, it is mine alone." He folded the note and put it in his pocket. He was prepared to be wrong. He was prepared, if necessary, to stand responsible for a catastrophe. On the German side, the night of June the 5th was playing out in a series of miscommunications and missed signals that would have decisive consequences. The German High Command had a standing alert protocol for the Normandy coast. Any sign of airborne activity or major naval movement would trigger a comprehensive alert. But the early hours of June the 6th saw this system function in ways that defied its own logic. When the first reports of parachute drops began to arrive at 7th Army headquarters, General Dahlmann and his staff were initially cautious. Reports of scattered paratroopers, in ones and twos and small groups, did not necessarily indicate a major invasion. Diversionary operations, raids, small drops to support the French resistance, these were all possibilities. The orders to mobilize the Panzer Reserve required a level of certainty that the reports, at first, did not provide. This hesitation cost precious time. Every hour in which the panzer divisions sat in their assembly areas was an hour in which the paratroopers on the flanks could consolidate their positions, and in which the ships of the invasion fleet drew closer to the beaches. At the headquarters of Army Group B, Rommel's Chief of Staff, General Hans Speidel, was receiving fragmentary reports but was reluctant to wake Rommel in Germany without clearer information. The standing agreement was that Rommel would be contacted immediately if the situation required it. But Speidel, working with incomplete reports in the early hours, held back. At OKW, the Supreme German Command headquarters, Hitler was asleep. This was not unusual. Hitler was famously a late sleeper, often staying up until the early hours of the morning and not rising until late in the day. His staff, knowing his temperament, was reluctant to wake him without absolute certainty that this was the main invasion and not a feint. And the specter of the Pas-de-Calais, the conviction, planted and nurtured by Allied deception, loomed large over every assessment. Was Normandy the real thing? Or was this a diversion, designed to draw the panzer reserves out of position before the real blow fell at the Pas-de-Calais? This question would not be answered by the German High Command until it was too late. The hesitation of those first crucial hours, the delay in committing the Panzer Reserve, the failure to fully mobilize the coastal defense system, was not the result of cowardice or incompetence. It was the result of uncertainty operating in a system designed to be cautious. And the Allied deception had made that uncertainty absolute. Meanwhile, the man who would prove to be the most consequential German commander of the day was preparing to act on his own initiative. Major General Edgar Feuchtinger, commanding the 21st Panzer Division south of Caen, had spent most of the night in Paris. He was, by several accounts, in the company of a French woman, which put him well outside the chain of command when the reports of airborne landings began to arrive. He returned to his headquarters in the early morning hours, found his division on alert but without orders, and began to organize a counterattack on his own authority. But even this decisiveness was hampered by the fragmented command structure. Parts of the 21st Panzer were redirected to support infantry operations north of Caen, away from where Feuchtinger wanted to strike. By the time the division was able to mount a coherent armored thrust toward the coast, it was late afternoon, and by then, British and Canadian troops had already established themselves ashore in enough strength to meet the attack. The 21st Panzer Division came very close to reaching the coast on June 6. Very close. And if it had done so, if it had driven a wedge between the British and Canadian landing zones, the consequences for the seaborne assault on the eastern flank would have been severe. But it did not. Not quite. And the reasons why are bound up in a chain of small decisions, small delays, small failures that accumulated through the night and into the morning. History is like that sometimes. Not decided by a single grand moment, but by the accumulation of small moments, each of them individually manageable, but together forming something that becomes irreversible. Part 6. The Fleet that Crossed the Night Sea. We have spoken of the paratroopers in the sky and the commanders at their maps. But there is another dimension of this night that deserves its own quiet contemplation, the sea. The invasion fleet, the formal name was Naval Force O, divided among 5 sector commands for the 5 beaches, was the largest naval armada ever assembled. 5,333 ships and craft of every description, battleships, cruisers, destroyers, minesweepers, landing ships and landing craft and barges and specialized vessels fitted with rockets or tanks or bulldozers or surgical equipment or any of the 1,000 other things that an invading army might need on its first day ashore. The ships had been gathering in the waters south of England for days, assembling from ports along the entire south coast, forming up in their assigned groups, following routes that had been swept for mines by the minesweeping flotillas that led the way in the darkness. Remarkably, and this is one of the genuine miracles of the night's navigation, the minesweeping operation was almost entirely successful. The fleet followed its cleared lanes through the darkness without significant loss. The men who were making this crossing, the soldiers in the flat-bottomed landing craft, the sailors on the destroyers standing off the beach, the coxswains trying to hold course in the swells, experienced the night in different ways. On the large ships, there was something almost surreal about it. An ordinary night watch, the familiar routine of the sea, and then out of the darkness, on all sides, the shadows of hundreds of other ships, more vessels than most sailors had ever seen assembled in one place, moving together in the darkness toward a coast that was beginning, in the final miles, to show the occasional distant flash of gunfire. On the landing craft, it was less surreal and more immediately terrible. The LCVPs, the small Higgins boats that would carry the first assault waves, were 36 feet long. They drew less than 3 feet of water when loaded. In 4 to 6 foot swells, they were rolling, plunging, shipping water. The men inside them, standing packed together or sitting on benches, were cold and wet and in many cases violently seasick. Some were bailing water with their helmets. A sergeant in the 1st Infantry Division, who would land at Omaha Beach in the first wave, wrote later that the crossing was the worst 3 hours of his life, worse in some ways than the beach itself, because on the beach you could at least do something. In the landing craft, you could only endure. The assault plan called for 32 DD tanks, duplex-drive tanks, swimming tanks fitted with a collapsible canvas screen that provided enough buoyancy to float, to be launched from their carriers several miles offshore and make their own way to the beach ahead of the infantry. They would arrive first, provide direct fire support against the German bunkers, and give the landing infantry a fighting chance against the guns on the bluffs above Omaha. The sea conditions on the Omaha approach were at the very edge of what the swimming tanks could manage. The naval officers in charge debated briefly and then made the decision: the tanks would be launched as planned. The canvas screens, designed for calmer water, were inadequate for the swells running off Omaha. One by one, almost as soon as they hit the water, the tanks began to swamp. The screens collapsed, or the seams gave way, or the waves simply overwhelmed the fragile buoyancy of the floating hulls. 27 of the 32 DD tanks launched for Omaha sank before they reached the shore. 27 tanks. Their crews, men trapped inside sealed metal hulls as they went to the bottom, were almost all lost. The infantry assault waves that followed would land on Omaha Beach without the armored support that the plan had counted on. They would face the machine guns and artillery on the bluffs above with their rifles and their determination and almost nothing else. The sea had given, and the sea had taken away. And the battle for the beaches had not even begun. Part 7: The Eastern Landings, Gold, Juno, and Sword. Let us move east along the Normandy coast, away from the American sector for a moment, and consider the 3 beaches where British and Canadian forces would land in the early hours of June the 6th. Gold Beach was assigned to the British 50th Infantry Division. Juno Beach to the 3rd Canadian Infantry Division. Sword Beach to the British 3rd Infantry Division, the formation tasked with the deepest inland objective of the entire day, the city of Cannes. The eastern landing zones differed from the American beaches in several important ways. The German defenses, while formidable, were distributed differently: more pillboxes and anti-tank guns at the water's edge, but somewhat less of the concentrated elevation that made Omaha so deadly. The tidal conditions were different, requiring the landings to begin later, which gave the Germans time to see what was happening in the west before the eastern assault went in. And the men were different, not in courage, but in composition and approach. The British and Canadian soldiers who landed on the eastern beaches were heirs to a different military tradition than their American counterparts, one that had absorbed the lessons of Gallipoli and Dieppe and 100 other costly operations, and which placed a premium on systematic preparation, fire support, and specialized equipment. The man responsible for this last element was Major General Percy Hobart, commanding the 79th Armored Division. Hobart had developed a range of specialized armored vehicles, nicknamed Hobart's Funnies by those who used them, specifically designed to overcome the obstacles of a defended beach landing. There were flail tanks, fitted with rotating drums of chains that beat the ground ahead of the vehicle to detonate mines. There were Armored Vehicle Royal Engineers, or AVREs, which carried large mortars capable of destroying concrete bunkers and could also carry fascines, large bundles of wood, to drop into anti-tank ditches. There were crocodile tanks fitted with flamethrowers. There were armored bulldozers and bridge-laying tanks and half a dozen other specialized variants. The Americans had been offered Hobart's funnies. They had, for the most part, declined them, with the exception of the DD swimming tanks, which they accepted. This decision would contribute to the catastrophe at Omaha Beach. On Golden Juno and Sword, the presence of the funnies would make a measurable difference in the casualties suffered by the first assault waves. The landing at Gold Beach began just after 7:30 in the morning on the eastern flank. The 50th Division's leading brigades went in against heavy fire from fortified positions along the seafront, particularly around the small village of La Rivière and the fortified German strongpoint at Le Hamel, where a specially constructed bunker held a powerful 75 mm gun that raked the beach for hours. The fighting on Gold Beach was hard. The casualties were significant. But the combination of armored support, naval gunfire, and the sheer determination of the assault brigades drove the defenders back, and by early afternoon, the 50th Division had penetrated several miles inland and was beginning to move toward its D-Day objective of Bayeux, which it would enter the following day, becoming the first town in France to be liberated from German occupation without significant damage. On Juno Beach, the Canadians went ashore in two sectors, divided by a rocky reef that forced a late change to the landing schedule. The delay meant the tide had risen higher than planned, covering many of the beach obstacles, and the landing craft suffered significant losses to mines and steel obstacles hidden just below the waterline. The Canadians took the highest percentage casualties of any of the three eastern landings. The fire from the German defensive positions in the seaside towns of Berniers and Courcelles was intense, and the narrow beach was quickly packed with men and vehicles, creating dangerous congestion. But the Canadians pushed through. The fighting in the beach villages was close and brutal, house to house, street to street, and the German defenders of some positions fought to the last. By midday, the Canadians had broken through the beach defenses and were pushing inland at a rate that exceeded every other landing sector. By the end of June the 6th, the 3rd Canadian Division had advanced farther inland than any other Allied formation. Some forward elements came within sight of the Cambayou Road, which had been marked on the planning maps as a hoped-for but ambitious D-Day objective. They were, for a brief moment, closer to completing the deepest Allied objective of the day than anyone. But they were a spearhead without support on either side. The 3rd British Division on their left had become locked in fighting around the beach exits. The 50th Division on their right had not yet linked up. The Canadians could not push to the Cambayou Road alone. They consolidated their gains, dug in, and waited for the rest of the front to catch up. On Sword Beach, the British 3rd Division had a different problem: congestion at the beach, caused by the German defenses holding up the advance off the sand, created a massive pileup of vehicles and men that made rapid movement inland nearly impossible for several critical hours. And the 21st Panzer Division was moving. By late afternoon, the lead elements of the 21st Panzer, redirected, reorganized, finally pointed toward the coast, were driving north between the British and Canadian landing zones. There was, in that direction, a gap. A genuine gap in the Allied line, between the western edge of the Sword Beach force and the eastern edge of the Juno Beach force, through which German armor might pass and reach the sea. If German tanks reached the sea between Sword and Juno, they would cut both forces off from reinforcement and supply. It would not end the invasion. The scale of what was already ashore made that impossible, but it would create a crisis that would take days to resolve and might cost thousands of lives. The lead German vehicles were destroyed. The counterattack halted. The gap that had seemed so dangerous was held, barely, by fire rather than by mass, and then the moment passed, and the gap began to close as more Allied forces came ashore. The eastern beaches had held. Not easily, not without cost, not without several moments of genuine danger. But they had held. Part 8, Omaha, the terrible shore. There is one beach that stands apart from all the others. One beach where everything that could go wrong had gone wrong, where the plan had unraveled so completely that for several hours on the morning of June the 6th, the senior officers watching from offshore believed that the landing had failed, and that the men who had survived the first waves would have to be withdrawn. That beach was Omaha. Omaha Beach was a crescent of sand roughly 6 miles long, flanked at each end by bluffs rising 100 feet or more above the waterline, and fronted by a mixture of sand and shingle beach that offered no natural cover whatsoever. Behind the narrow beach, a seawall and then a tangle of wire and stakes and mines, and then the bluffs, and in the bluffs and at their base, a network of German bunkers, firing positions, and mortar emplacements that commanded every inch of the beach below. The 1st Infantry Division, the Big Red One, one of the most experienced formations in the American Army, was assigned to the eastern half of Omaha. The 29th Infantry Division, going into its first major combat, was assigned to the western half. Together, they would put roughly 34,000 men ashore on Omaha on June the 6th. But first, they had to cross the beach. The bombardment that was supposed to suppress the German defenses before the assault had largely failed. The heavy bombers of the 8th Air Force had been ordered to bomb the Omaha defenses in the 30 minutes before the landing. Flying through cloud, afraid of hitting the landing craft below, they had delayed their bomb releases by a few seconds, just long enough for the bombs to fall inland, harmlessly, in the fields behind the beach. The DD tanks, the swimming Shermans that were supposed to provide direct fire support, had sunk. The rocket barrage from the landing craft, intended to cut the wire and suppress the forward German positions, had fallen short, into the water. The naval bombardment had been brief and, against concrete positions designed to withstand it, only partially effective. The German defenders of the 352nd Infantry Division were alive, unshaken, in their positions, when the first American landing craft grounded on the beach at approximately 6:30 in the morning. The ramps went down, and the German machine guns opened fire. This is the moment that those who were there and those who have written about it struggle most with, the precise, the unflinching, the unbearable quality of the fire that met the men at the water's edge. Some men were killed before they left the landing craft. The ramp went down, and the machine gun in the bunker directly ahead traced a line across it, and men fell into the water. Others made it to the beach. But the beach offered no cover. The men had been trained to move, to advance, to get off the beach as quickly as possible. Training and reality collided. The fire was too heavy to advance against. Men went to ground behind whatever they could find, bodies of other men, the steel obstacles on the beach, the small ridgeline of shingle at the water's edge. Entire boat sections were destroyed within minutes of landing. Medics moved along the beach, doing what they could. Officers tried to rally their men. Many of those officers were shot within moments of landing. The command structure of the first assault wave disintegrated almost immediately. By 7 o'clock in the morning, Omaha Beach was, in the assessment of the officers observing from offshore, a disaster. Men were pinned on the beach or sheltering in the water. Several landing craft had been hit and were burning. The shingle bank was lined with the dead and the wounded and the men who had not yet found a way to move forward. And the tide was coming in. The tidal rise on Omaha was significant, nearly 18 feet between low water and high. As the tide came in, the beach narrowed, and the men pinned on it were pushed toward the German defenses they could not advance against. The math was brutal and simple. If the men did not move forward, the rising tide would drown those who had survived the fire. This is where the story of Omaha Beach becomes something different from a military disaster. Because in the midst of the chaos, among the destroyed equipment and the failing communications and the crumbling plan, individual men began to act. General Norman Cota, the assistant divisional commander of the 29th Division, waded ashore in the second wave and found himself on a beach where the plan had collapsed. He began to walk. He walked along the beach in the open, under fire, talking to the men, pulling them out of their shock, pointing to the bluffs. Two kinds of people are staying on this beach, he is reported to have said. The dead and those who are going to die. Now let's get the hell out of here. It was not eloquent. But it was honest. And it moved men who had been frozen in place. Similar things were happening in other places along the beach. Small groups, often not the pre-planned units, but whoever happened to be in the same stretch of beach together, began to find ways through the wire and up the draws and gullies in the bluffs. They used Bangalore torpedoes to cut gaps in the wire. They found draws that were less heavily defended than the main exits. They crawled forward on their stomachs through the mines and the fire. Destroyers of the U.S. Navy, watching through binoculars as the battle on the beach failed to advance, made a decision that their orders did not strictly authorize. They moved into dangerously shallow water, so shallow that some of them were scraping the bottom, and began to fire directly at the German positions on the bluffs, sometimes at ranges of less than 1,000 yards. The risk to the ships was considerable. The value to the men on the beach was immeasurable. The destroyer USS Frankfurt, her captain reportedly navigating by watching the spray from the bottom and staying just above it, fired until her gun barrels were smoking. Other destroyers followed. The combination of the small groups breaching the bluffs from below, the point-blank fire of the destroyers, and the gradually diminishing fire from German positions that were being taken from behind by men who had found the unguarded draws, by midday, Omaha Beach was no longer in the balance. It was still a terrible place, still under fire, still not secured. But the men were moving inland. The cost was staggering. Casualty figures for Omaha Beach vary by source and methodology, but the consensus among historians suggests that the two American divisions suffered somewhere between 2,000 and 4,000 casualties on June 6, killed, wounded, and missing. The exact number is unknown because record-keeping in the chaos of that day was, understandably, imperfect. What is not unknown is this: those men bought a foothold with their lives, and the men who came after them walked across a beach that had been purchased at the highest price the currency of war demands. Part 9, Utah, the landing that changed course. There is a strange footnote in the history of the Normandy landings that is easy to overlook in the shadow of Omaha's sacrifice. At Utah Beach, the westernmost of the 5 landing zones, something happened that had no parallel in the planning of the entire operation. And in its own way, it illuminates one of the most important truths about the nature of military operations at their most complex. Utah Beach went as well as anyone had dared to hope. Better, even. The casualties in the assault were the lowest of any of the 5 beaches, roughly 200 men, a number that seems almost impossibly small against the backdrop of what happened at Omaha 6 miles to the east. But the story of Utah is not simply a story of things going right. It is a story of things going wrong in a direction that, by fortune or providence or the sheer accumulated competence of the men involved, turned out to be better than what had been planned. The assault waves for Utah Beach were blown south of their intended landing point by the tidal current. The naval vessels carrying the landing craft, trying to maintain position in the difficult sea conditions, had drifted. By the time the first assault waves were ready to go in, the officers in the control vessels realized that they were not in front of the planned landing zone. They were, in fact, about 2,000 yards south of where they were supposed to be. 2,000 yards along the beach, a significant distance, nearly a mile and a quarter. Brigadier General Theodore Roosevelt, Jr., the son of the 26th president, was in the first wave at Utah. He was 56 years old. He walked with a cane as a result of wounds and arthritis. He had lobbied his commanding general personally for permission to land with the first wave, arguing that his presence would steady the men. He was the oldest man in the first assault wave, and the only general. When Roosevelt recognized that the landing had gone off course, he did what the situation demanded. He walked along the beach under fire, studying the terrain, looking at where the obstacles were, where the draws led, what the German defenses looked like in this place versus where they had been briefed to expect them. And then he made a decision. He told the officers around him, "We'll start the war from right here." The planned landing zone had been more heavily defended. The 2,000 yards of drift had brought the assault wave in at a point where the German defenses were thinner, where the beach obstacles were fewer, where the exits inland were more accessible. The accident of navigation had, in a way that no planner could have arranged, placed the first wave of Utah in a better position than the one that had been selected for them. This does not diminish the skill and courage of the men who made the most of that position. Roosevelt's quick decision to adapt, to accept the deviation and exploit it rather than trying to redirect the subsequent waves back to the planned landing point, was a masterclass in the kind of tactical flexibility that separates good commanders from mediocre ones. The 4th Infantry Division pushed inland from Utah Beach on June the 6th and made contact, by late afternoon, with elements of the 101st Airborne Division that had been fighting their way toward the coast since the early morning hours. The causeways were secured. The beachhead at Utah was intact. But the story of Utah on June the 6th cannot be told without returning to the sky, because the paratroopers of the 101st and 82nd Airborne were still fighting in the fields and hedgerows and flooded lowlands behind Utah, and their situation, for most of the day, was far more precarious than it looked from the beach. The chaos of the night drop had scattered battalions across dozens of square miles of Norman countryside. Men who had been designated to seize specific crossroads or causeways were fighting instead wherever they found themselves, against German units that were equally confused about what was happening. The fluid, fragmented battle in the Norman bocage, the hedgerow country, with its ancient earthen banks topped by thick vegetation that created a natural defensive position every 30 yards, was unlike any training the paratroopers had received. In this environment, the qualities that made the American airborne soldier distinctive were tested to their limit. Initiative. Self-reliance. The ability to function without a chain of command, to make decisions based on the immediate situation rather than the plan that no longer existed. Many of the paratroopers never found their units on June the 6th. They fought as members of whatever group of Americans they encountered, under whoever was the senior officer or simply whoever proved to be the most effective leader. Some groups were a dozen men. Some were 100. Some were everything in between. By nightfall, the overall position of the American airborne was far better than it had appeared during the chaos of the night drop. The main objectives, the causeways behind Utah, the town of St. Miraglise, the critical road junctions, were in American hands, or being contested in the Americans' favor. The Germans had failed to mount any organized counterattack against the airborne perimeter in the first day. But the cost of that night in the sky would be tabulated for weeks. Of the approximately 13,000 American paratroopers dropped on Normandy in the early hours of June the 6th, several thousand became casualties in the first 24 hours. The exact figure is disputed, but the loss among some specific units was devastating. Entire companies that had trained together for 2 years landed in the wrong place, were shot in the air or in the first minutes after landing, and ceased to exist as organized military formations before the sun rose. These men are part of the night before dawn. They are part of why D-Day almost failed before it properly began. Part 10: The Cost, the Legacy, and the Meaning of the Day. By the evening of June the 6th, 1944, the question that had hung over the entire day, the question that Eisenhower had spent sleepless nights preparing to answer in failure, had been answered in the only terms that war allows: provisional, costly, incomplete, and irreversible. The Allies were ashore in Normandy. 5 beaches. 160,000 men. A lodgment on the coast of occupied France that was, in places, only a mile or 2 deep, in places more, in places precarious, but a lodgment that existed, that was being reinforced with every ship that came in, that the Germans, for all their armor and all their fortifications, had not been able to throw back into the sea. The cost had been enormous. The German casualties are harder to establish, partly because of the destruction of German records in the final months of the war, but estimates range from 4,000 to 9,000, with the majority of that uncertainty reflecting the difficulty of accounting for casualties among the many non-German formations serving in the 7th Army. The French civilian population of Normandy also suffered. The bombing and naval bombardment that preceded the landings killed a significant number of Norman civilians. Estimates range from 3,000 to 5,000 on June the 6th alone. The people of towns like Caen, which was bombed by the British and Canadians, were subjected to destruction on a scale they had not seen even in the worst days of the German occupation. These civilian casualties are part of the moral weight of the day. They are not comfortable to contemplate, and they should not be comfortable. The men who planned the operation knew that French civilians would die. They accepted this cost as the price of the larger liberation. Whether that calculation was correct is a question that the Normans who survived it have given different answers to, and it is not our place to simplify an answer that deserves its complexity. The strategic consequences of June 6 unfolded over the weeks and months that followed. The battle for Normandy itself, the campaign to break out of the lodgment and into the open country of France, lasted until the end of July, costing both sides enormously. The city of Caen, which had been a D-Day objective for the British 3rd Division, was not fully in Allied hands until mid-July, and its destruction in the fighting was so total that it had to be substantially rebuilt after the war. The breakout from Normandy, Operation Cobra, launched in late July, finally cracked the German defensive line and allowed the Allied armored formations to sweep across northern France at a pace that stunned even the optimistic Allied planners. Paris was liberated in August. By September, Allied forces were at the borders of Germany itself. The Normandy campaign was not the end of the war in Europe. That would take another 11 months of grinding, costly fighting through France, Belgium, the Netherlands, and Germany itself, including the crisis of the German Ardennes offensive in December of 1944, the Battle of the Bulge, which demonstrated that even a fatally weakened Germany could still strike with dangerous force. But Normandy was the turning point in the West that could not be undone. Once the Allies were ashore and established, once the German strategic reserve, the panzer divisions that Rommel and von Rundstedt had fought over, had been committed to the Normandy battle and bled down in the fighting around Caen and Saint-Lô, the outcome in the West was determined. It was not certain how long it would take, or what it would cost. But the direction was fixed. On the Eastern Front, the Soviet summer offensive of 1944, Operation Bagration, was launched on June 23, just 2.5 weeks after D-Day. It was one of the most powerful military operations of the entire war, destroying the German Army Group center in a matter of weeks and advancing hundreds of miles westward. The coordination between the Western and Eastern Allied offensives was not accidental, it was the fulfillment of the strategic promise that had been discussed at Tehran, the simultaneous pressure from both directions that Hitler's Germany could not withstand. The war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945. 11 months after D-Day. At a cost, in addition to everything that had come before, of hundreds of thousands of additional Allied and German lives, and the final liberation of the concentration camps and the full revelation of what the Nazi regime had done in the years of its dominion. How do we hold all of this together? The courage of the paratroopers falling through the dark, the deaths on the beach, the strategic arguments of the generals, the civilians sheltering in their cellars, the sailors navigating by instinct through the minefield, the German soldiers in their bunkers who had their own humanity and their own reasons for being there. We hold it with honesty. With the acknowledgement that what happened on June 6, 1944 was accomplished by human beings, fallible, frightened, determined human beings, who were asked to do something that had never been done before and who did it imperfectly, as all human things are imperfect, and at a cost that must never be made comfortable or abstract. The plan almost failed. It almost failed because of weather, and because of a scattered airborne drop, and because of sunken tanks, and because of a mismatch between what the bombardment achieved and what it needed to achieve, and because of 1,000 small calculations that turned out to be wrong. It succeeded because of the men on the beaches who moved when moving meant almost certain death. Because of the destroyer captains who scraped their hulls on the bottom to get their guns close enough to matter. Because of a brigadier general with a cane who walked along a beach that was in the wrong place and decided that it was exactly the right place. It succeeded because of the paratroopers who gathered in the dark with strangers and fought as though they had trained together for years. Because of the Canadian soldiers who pushed inland farther than anyone expected on a beach that cost them more than anyone wanted to admit. Because of the British engineers who drove their strange, ungainly machines through the sand and wire and gave the infantry a path forward through the obstacles. It succeeded, in a very real sense, because the Germans could not agree on where to put their tanks. The confluence of all these things, the human and the mechanical, the planned and the improvised, the brilliant and the catastrophically wrong, is what military historians mean when they speak of the contingency of history. The idea that outcomes are not inevitable. That they depend on choices, and on chance, and on the particular qualities of the particular people who find themselves at the particular moment when the choice must be made. On June 6, 1944, the choices were made. The costs were paid. The outcome became fixed. And the world that followed, imperfect, troubled, incomplete, but freed from the particular darkness of the Third Reich, was built on the foundation of what happened on those 5 beaches and in that scattered night sky. We owe those men a kind of attention that does not simplify them. Not the reverential simplification that turns them into symbols rather than people. Not the cynical simplification that reduces their sacrifice to the decisions of politicians and generals. But the honest, sustained attention that says, this is what it cost, and this is what it meant, and we should not pretend otherwise. That is the weight of June 6th. And it can be carried, and it should be carried, gently and honestly and with full knowledge of what it contains. Closing meditation. The dawn came to Normandy on June 6th, 1944, the way dawn comes to all the world, slowly, without drama, the darkness simply thinning at the edges until the shapes of things became visible again. By that dawn, the beach at Omaha was already strewn with the evidence of what the night and the morning had required. The fields behind Utah were dotted with the parachutes of men who had fallen through the dark. The bridges of Bonneville had been held for hours against counterattacks by a small group of men who had landed in gliders and fought with everything they had. The tide had come in and gone out on all 5 beaches, and was coming in again. History does not stop at the end of a day, or a battle, or a campaign. It continues, always, into the next moment and the next generation. But sometimes there are days that carry more weight than others. Days that concentrate the choices and the costs and the courage of an era into something that can be looked at directly, in one place, in one light. June 6th, 1944, is one of those days. Tonight, as you settle toward sleep, let what we have carried together through these hours rest gently in its proper place. The men we have spoken of, the ones whose names history recorded, and the far greater number whose names are known only to the families who mourned them, have already given what they had to give. What we can offer them is simply this: to remember, and to understand, and to carry the knowledge of what was paid so that the words might mean something more than words. That peace was made. It did not simply arrive. It was made, at enormous cost, by ordinary people placed in extraordinary circumstances, and it deserves to be held carefully. Let your breath slow. Let the weight of the day settle. Let sleep come gently, as it always does, toward those who have listened long and carefully and with open hearts. Rest now. We will carry the history together, night by night, one careful hour at a time. If you're still awake, the battles are over now. Rest easy. Subscribe to Wars and Dusk for a new story every week. Sweet dreams.